Sir, it's audible. It's audible.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, okay, sir. Let's just start with the podcast. I've started the recording. I've started
Yeah.
the recording.
Just a second. Yeah.
So, yeah,
Go ahead.
the following is a conversation with Abhishek Kumar, who is a computer vision enthusiast and one of the best guys that I've seen in LinkedIn. Not because he posts every day about something new about what computer vision field is all about. It also gives me an enriching knowledge and also an immense pleasure to welcome him for this podcast. I think this
Thanks a lot, buddy.
podcast, yeah, it's actually my pleasure having you on the podcast. I think probably the way he has shared the knowledge through his LinkedIn, probably today the podcast is going to be amazing in terms of answering the questions regarding what a computer vision engineer needs in the present scenario
Mhm.
and how to fight back and win as an engineer. Thank you so much, sir.
Hopefully, I can answer.
Oh, we can.
Sure. Go ahead.
Why did you pick the field of computer vision?
Basically, it all started back in my first year of college. I joined. I mean, you know how BITS is. So we used to join different clubs and departments. So I joined one of the departments, and there a lot of people were, working on robotics. I mean, the department wasn't for robotics, but the people there were working on robotics. So those seniors helped me understand what robotics is, and in that there were multiple sub-disciplines. So they introduced me to image processing. I mean, it was back then the image processing thing, not the computer vision and deep learning that we call now. Yeah. So it all started with that, and I was, excited about mathematics first. So that's why engineering. I mean, that's how Indians go, right? I mean, mathematics after engineering, and with images, it was intuitive actually. So I could understand if there's an input and there's something applied to it, there's the output is quite intuitive, and I can understand that. And that wasn't the case with electronics. That was my department. I mean, I wasn't able to gain ki transistors, what is happening with transistors or what is not happening with them. So that was the thing. And so this field, I mean, I found it quite interesting. And then with the advent of machine learning, I started exploring more, and then deep learning. And after that, I started working with a lot of startups, basically remotely from our college, so that I can get a brief overview of what's happening in the different fields like medical imaging, facial analysis, retail domain. So I used to work remotely with them, and thus the interest kept growing.
Yeah, that interest actually has built you as a new person, as an engineer. Because every time when I see your post, I feel like, okay, I should be somebody like him one day. Thank you for
Oh
that.
man, that's a good compliment. Thank you.
Thank you for that answer, respecting the same answer because hustle has never changed in you. And let me just ask you, you have been working remotely with a lot of startups, you have been working
Yeah.
on a lot of problem statements. What is vision? What is
Mhm.
intelligence according to you?
Vision and intelligence. I mean, if you consider artificial intelligence, I mean, if we want to go towards that side, then yes, something like how a child perceives different things when he's first given the opportunity to see or look at that thing is something very fascinating. And I mean, we are nowhere near that part of intelligence at present, but that is something I see as intelligence. Like you see something and you try to interpret using the prior knowledge you have, rather than expecting someone to tell you what exactly that is and how it goes. And the vision for me is something like if we are talking about the field of robotics, or say we are talking about the field of automation, vision is something quite intuitive, and it forms a crucial part of it. Not the most important part of it, but a very crucial part of it, because most of the things that how we, I mean, in our senses itself, vision forms a very crucial part. So that I feel is something how they are related, and we are nowhere towards AGI, but yes, someday.
It's not about AGI also. We are not trying to build the APIs as strong as that. Because when I see APIs on Edge and REST APIs on the cloud, I don't feel like we are ever going to touch AGI as a fact. Because Jitendra Malik used to say, if you want 99.99% accuracy, work for 5 years. Then AGI is supposed to be 100% accurate. What can they do?
Yeah.
Like I always had this doubt when I started as
Okay.
a computer vision enthusiast.
Uh-huh.
Now I do internship and I go for other places where I do work on Flutter and other applications. There are APIs involved in
Mm-hmm.
everything. Do you really
Yeah.
think so that tomorrow APIs, hardware, software architecture today is good enough to build an
Mm-hmm.
AGI or a brain on a
Mm-hmm.
burning box like CPU, GPU, or a general purpose GPU, or else or a matter of fact, edge computer?
uh, as of today, I guess AGI is like some 30 to 40 years away, considering the technologies that you mentioned and how things are going ahead. So that is something I don't think with the current technology or the current hardware or the API that you mentioned, we are going towards that. But I think I overheard you saying that AGI is supposed to be 100% accurate. I guess if you're trying to replicate a human, we can't expect AGI to have 100% accuracy. So I mean, yes, it's all about an open-ended question, and people are always debating on it. So that's my perspective on things. And with regards to APIs, I particularly feel that it's a medium to access a deep tech rather than something that is. I mean, it's a core technology, but it's a medium to access the deep tech, the brain of things. So there's a human interface and there's a deep tech, and I guess the bridge is the API as of what we call it today. I don't know how things will change ahead, but this is something. I mean, it's not something that it will hinder AGI or it will affect AGI. I mean, it has nothing to do with this, what I feel. But uh, that's it's like a tool to actually access the brain. And I mean, the brain. I mean, I'm not saying the brain as an AI, but something that is smart enough to say detect an object or recognize some speech and make it available to a user interface or an application that a person is using.
Yeah, I feel it's not about the AGI that we are going to build tomorrow, or not about the computer vision system that is going to change the entire
Mm-hmm.
way in the business infrastructure or anything as in deep learning infrastructure is going to work. I feel that there is a lot of trade-offs in the computer vision itself. Let it be in terms of
Okay.
algorithm, let it be in terms of setting the goals as a realistic one. Because when we see GANs, it's
Mm-hmm.
just a mathematical approximation
Yeah.
of what this image can be if I apply the
Hmm.
transformation of this sort. What do you think
Hmm.
the major trade-off in today's computer vision?
The industry as such or the technology?
I feel both industry and technology. Because when I see OpenCV,
Okay.
there is something which is more coming. Because every day you will be posting
Uh-huh.
something new. Or else, if I see the industry, IBM has its own approach, Google has its own approach, Apple has its own approach, but
Mm-hmm.
we are
Mm-hmm.
stashed with the brute force search algorithms. What is the
Yeah.
trade-off that we are still facing today, according to you?
Mm-hmm. Sure, sure. So let me start with the approach thing. That is actually a very good thing that everyone is having their own approaches, and this field isn't saturated enough. So that makes it really interesting. So, I mean, if you consider the older fields, I mean, the fields which have already been there till now, there are set methodologies and set practices that you can carry out, and things will tend to work out for your case. But when you are actually working in the deep tech, the AI field, the so-called AI field, I doubt this set methodologies or set practices will actually work for you, and that's a good thing. But here comes the trade-off. I mean, let's start from the data and let's move towards the deployment part of it. So it always starts with expectations settings, like you have something to be built and there's data available or not. So from there, the data itself, the trade-off starts where the data, do you have that data, whether it is perfectly annotated or not, how diverse that data is, I mean, how exactly correlated the data is with regards to where you are trying to deploy your system. I mean, I'm telling you in the perspective of computer vision itself. Say, we want to deploy a self-driving car system, and you are developing a vision part of it, and it's happening, it's to be deployed in India. So if you are using the data from somewhere else, say towards the west, it might not work here. So that is one trade-off or one sort of a hindrance that exists here. Then we move towards the algorithms. So you might have heard about this no free lunch theorem.
That's
So
actually
there, I
the
mean, it's
postulate for all our machine learning, deep learning engineers.
exactly. I mean, no one algorithm is going to, I mean, you cannot always say that one algorithm is always going to be the best one. I mean, if you change the data, something that could work for you, that has worked for you previously, might not work for me. I mean, whatever application I'm using. So there, the trade-off comes in. I mean, you can't call it a trade-off as such, but sort of a experimentation. I mean, more experimentation one has to carry out in order to understand what kind of algorithm is best suited for his or her data. And then we move towards the deployment part of it. It could be cloud, it could be your edge systems, it could be on your phones, anywhere. So there, the trade-off is something like, there the trade-off comes about the accuracy and the speed of execution, how you want to actually go about it. And all these things have a set of expectations from the, say, I mean, if you are in services, it could be a client. If you are at a product, it could be a user. So the media has shown AI or AI systems where it's fairly accurate and super fast, but it doesn't work that way. So the expectation settings are the majority thing that needs to be cleared off when it comes to developing and understanding the trade-off in this industry.
Yeah, you talked about expectation of what engineers has to set, realistic
Yeah,
expectations. But like,
yeah.
I feel there should be one thing that is making our life much more easier today. What is that one
Mm-hmm.
thing which is making any computer science, maybe a computer vision or a computer architect's
Mm-hmm.
life easier today? In terms of what you used to find when you
It's a good
were doing
question.
your bachelor's and today.
Mm-hmm. I guess I would say it's abundance of knowledge, free knowledge available on the internet. It's making the life easier, as well as it is creating a lot of overwhelming anxiety in you as to you cannot keep up with the pace of the development that is happening. Earlier, when things started off, I guess the free resources that are available at present, say it on YouTube, say it your blog, say it your codes that are there on GitHub, the open source society, and the communities that have come up. It wasn't that big, especially in India. It wasn't that big in, say, back in 2012 or 2013. So I guess the common factor from that day till today is the Stack Overflow. That has made a lot of difference in the lives of coders. So that is one thing. And I guess, yeah, knowledge and abundance of free knowledge is something that I feel is really helping a lot of people. I mean, you can say, I mean, there are a lot of podcasts these days, there are a lot of webinars these days, there are a lot of workshops and these competitions that are hosted on Kaggle and CodaLab. I mean, you can learn immensely from there. You can also get overwhelmed by the fact that so many people are doing so many things and how to start with. But yes, if you plan it well, yes, you can learn.
Like you told about planning things out.
Yeah.
Like you also told about how free and open source content is available for the
Yeah.
creators like us. Like what's the
Mm-hmm.
thrill you get when you read a computer vision research paper? Might be ARXA, NIPS, or anything. What's that first
Okay.
thrill? What's that first factor that thrills you out saying that this paper is something which is more phenomenal? Or else do you search paper based on your purpose or just for the fun of it?
I go both the ways, but it's not just about computer vision papers, actually. I mean, I'm quite interested towards astronomy. And with regards to the human brain, the computational neuropsychology,
Yeah.
these are the two fields that quite fascinate me. And they somehow resemble the fact that we don't know a lot. And that is the thrill I get when I read a paper or an article or a blog, when I'm trying to understand actually what's happening and how the things are going ahead. So it does, I mean, it's a thrill. Yeah, exactly. The word is actually thrill, that you got to know something new. But I must confess that, like, if I read 10 research papers on, say, computer vision, 8 of them I don't understand. That happens a lot of time. That happens. I mean, it's difficult to understand a lot of papers, because I personally feel like papers these days are going towards the end of, I want to throw jargons and show how accurate my model is, rather than working towards reproducibility, understanding what's exactly, I mean, making it understandable to all kind of audiences, the beginners, the experts, and everyone. And yes, I did mention about reproducibility is something that I would want to see in a paper. But yeah, that thrill is something like if I understand the paper, then I feel that I've learned something today. That's the first thing that comes into my mind.
Thanks for being much honest, because every time when anybody comes to anything like reading papers or something, they don't confess that I don't understand 8 of the papers out of the 10.
Oh, I don't.
Because it's the truth, because everybody can't understand everything. Like,
Yeah.
we are just trying to demystify the brain and it's not working. Blue Gene is working, Human Brain Project is
Yeah.
working, lot of organizations are working. Like, let me just ask you this one question, which actually might be very close to your field of work. what
Hmm.
what is hardware according to you, and what makes an hardware and a software unique in terms of its performance? Is it
Hmm.
the algorithm, or else just the set of code which you have imported as a framework? Or what is it making
Hmm.
that uniqueness in a system where you have stashed your
Hmm.
hardware and your algorithm, and basically your mind and your work? What does it feel to you? What's your viewpoint on that?
I guess it's codependent, both the things. I mean, they cannot exist without each other, the hardware and the software. I mean, of course, metaphysically, hardware can exist without a software, but I mean, to make it, I mean, to get something useful out of it, I guess it's actually codependent in a manner that an algorithm could be superb and brilliant, but the hardware that you've got at present with you might not be able to cope up with it, the speed that you are expecting, or it might even just crash it up. And on the other hand, you might have like a DGX system at your place, and all you can think about is import TensorFlow. So that's the thing. I mean, it's actually quite codependent on each other, and it should be planned. I mean, for me, if the goal is something to create a good, a unique product that has a hardware and a software on it, or a service that has hardware and software on it, I would actually want to understand what exactly the expectations from the users are. I mean, see, I was talking to a student today, and he was mentioning about an attendance system. He wants to create an attendance system in school, and he was worried about how can I manage the 10K people in the school, 10,000 students in the school, and do their attendance. I said, I mean, it's not required for you to do the attendance in a real time. The student, if the face is captured, I mean, suppose there's a classroom and the faces of everyone is captured, you can process it and take a day, take a week. It's just about whenever you are tallying the scores, attendance should be perfect. So his goal is towards accuracy rather than getting a very real time system. So in that way, I would say the actual goal of the user and what the user is trying to understand from the system makes it unique rather than the hardware or the software and how things are correlated towards it.
Yeah, there are a lot of speculations on how computer vision engineers work in the
Uh-huh.
beginning stages. When you
Okay.
start as in work, there are a lot of things where you don't understand the process. And also, when we take an example of an engineer, a software engineer who just gets into the industry, he hears the word called as agile, scrum, kanban, and they get flown away saying that, okay, this is not for me, boss. What was that one
Yeah.
factor which made you fear and which made you comfortable in this industry of computer vision?
Okay. With regards to fear, I still fear that is, and it's not just computer
I'm
vision.
like, why?
Sorry.
Why?
Uh-huh.
Why?
No,
Why?
I'm just let me tell you what that thing is. You will understand why. It's not just computer vision industry; it's computer science industry as such. I cannot, I mean, do good with competitive coding. You give me 90 minutes and 4 tasks, I won't be able to solve one. So that is one thing that I actually don't like about the way the interviews are taken and the way things are in the industry. But yes, it does give a good perspective about the candidate. I'm not denying that. That is one thing with regards to general software industry. With regards to computer vision, I think how I start with a problem statement is something I can tell you. I usually tend to look up for a lot of open source code in the beginning, and I try to understand. I try to just implement them on my data to see how things are moving on. That gives me a better perspective and comparative perspective, and it just calms my mind down that I have seen a lot of things, and now these three are the ones that can work. So it cannot be like, I mean, suppose I'm sitting today and there's one algorithm that has worked very well for me. 10 days later, a new one will come and just replace it off. But for today, I'm happy that this one or two algorithms are working good for my data. And that's how I begin with. I don't know if this is some sort of the standard approach people take or not. But with the people I've interacted over social media or over in person, so most of them have mentioned the same thing. Like they want to explore different algorithms on the data first and then see how it goes. So availability of those algorithms is something that eases the process. And the one thing I fear is the same thing. Competitive coding, I just fear. I mean, I'm just afraid of it. How
Yeah,
about you? I mean, what's your perspective on competitive coding?
I'm very bad in competitive coding because
Okay.
every time when I start with a new problem statement, I first go to the depth of it. First, I see even if the data is 2 TB, I'll be like one file, next file, next file. Then afterwards, and I make sure that okay, cleansing part done. Okay, tick mark to that. How about the algorithms? Then I start searching archive for the algorithms. I'm like, okay, boss, ये तो बड़ा है. I'm like, I can't reach out every aspect of the computer vision, but let me just work on which is available for me. And like I also explore a lot of open source codes, just like CatBoost, XGBoost,
Yeah.
and other algorithms, which are like openly
Yeah.
available for you. And I tend
Yeah.
to see how the Kaggle competitors or like people in the Kaggle how they are tuning their model. Because to me, tuning parameters is something which I really fear because I worked on the same data set which they have worked. I worked on the same framework, but yet my results are not according to them. Or else my
Yeah.
results might go better than them. I'm like, what is
Yeah.
happening? Because because I'm an EC guy, everything to
Yeah.
me
Same.
is set of wires and transistors. Because if I was in computer science guy, I would have said, okay, this API is not working. Okay, next API. To me, I
Yeah.
go then I buy some Jetson Nano. Afterwards, I just go for the Raspberry Pi back once again. It's a kind of I just
Cycle.
juggle here and there, and I just come back. And probably I think the best thing that I can do is transfer learning, where I can just deploy the model on a Flutter application. Okay, that's it. No, that's what I feel.
Got it.
Thanks for asking me for that
Okay.
question also in a podcast, which I'm taking it. Yeah, like let's just
Good,
get
good,
back
good.
to it. Anyways, there
Yeah.
are a lot of things where data deployment is working. Data set is making something more humongous because 2 terabytes of
Uh-huh.
data from the very most open data set is something which is not enough to build a self-driving car today. What is
Hmm.
making that data set and a data deployment unique? And also, what do you feel about benchmarking a model? Let it be a TF Lite model, H5PY model, SDFI model, anything. What do you feel about benchmarking those models in terms of performance? And it can be of anything, of any sort. Can it be can it be used in bioinformatics? Yes, because when I see algorithms getting mixed matched, because I have seen ISRO,
Okay.
there's a scientist in ISRO called as Ritu Karidal. She had told that in one of her TED Talks, in most of her TED Talks, in almost of every TED Talk,
Okay.
just says that the algorithm which was supposed to work for a space machine worked fantastically on a cancer data set. And I feel so that we are not building the right math or something, because that's my view about it. What's your view on benchmarking deep learning models and also about data and deployment today?
Data and deployment as in how they're
It can
dependent on
be
each
in
other
terms
or
of
something.
cloud, it can be on some dependency, it can also be in terms of how they are cleaning the data set. Because when I see min max pooling and all, or else triple stratify k fold, There are new ways in which data set is being analyzed, but yet
Okay.
we are not getting to a point where it behaves exactly like a human being. That's what my
Yeah.
question
Yeah.
was all about. Will data set and the deployment make the life of an engineer easy, that he can get a brain stashed on some DXC system, or else can be on a cloud cluster? That's my question.
Okay. So I'll start with the benchmarking thing. So I believe benchmarking does one good thing where you have certain standard data sets like Coco, Pascal, and Open Images, where you can get a brief overview of whether the algorithm outperforms the ones that you have seen, or there are. I mean, you can get a ranking based on some sort of an metric. It could be speed, it could be accuracies, it could be mean average precisions, anything. But when it comes to actual deployment, I mean, when it comes to actually training it or testing it on your data set, the real world environment, it won't behave it like that. And that's the generalizability that you cannot quantify. So basically, you can quantify something on a finite data. But when it comes to real world applications, say a self-driving car, there are infinite possibilities. I mean, you just go out today with a bike in India, and you will know there are infinite possibilities of. I mean, there are different minds that are driving the vehicles. You don't know what can happen when. It's exciting. Driving in India is really exciting. So that is one thing. And since there are infinite possibilities, you cannot have a standard metric whether it is generalizing well or not. So that is something where your benchmarking fails. Your benchmarking, I mean, you have a test set that correlates with your general world, but it cannot have all the possibilities. Benchmarking there, I feel, is, but to begin with, it does help. I mean, you want to take, I mean, suppose you are analyzing a content-based image retrieval algorithm. So you will try to see which one is faster and which one is more accurate, and how big the database it's working on, and how fast it's retrieving the data. So you'll go with it. You will try. I mean, at least you'll pick that first for your data. So that solves things a bit. And when it comes to your second part of thing where you mentioned about the space, I mean, an algorithm developed for space working on cancer data. I mean, my personal opinion is convolutional neural networks and the deep learning at present is dumb when it comes to computer vision.
Even Geoffrey Hinton says that.
Yeah, I mean, it's really dumb. Uh, the model was supposed, I mean, if it was a replica of, say, a cat's brain or your brain or whoever's brain, it should have the capability to learn at least 2 to 3 things at once. Now, if it's detecting a car, it will keep detecting a car. It can't go and detect a cancer element. But the algorithm, if trained on a cancer data, it will start detecting the cancer. Again, it will forget about the car, because there's no correlation between those two sort of a data. So there, I guess, is where generalizability and the sort of you can say how I mean, how not intelligent the CNNs are. So that is one thing. Then moving on to your data set and deployment part, could you rephrase your question as to what exactly you want me to mention about there? I mean, I didn't
think
get the context of it.
I think once I had asked you, can we have machine insights? In an LinkedIn post which you had posted, I had asked you, can ever machines have machine insights? Just like how Fei Fei Li, she in the PhD work, she used to just make the people gaze an image for 500 milliseconds. Now, the amount of information those people used to give about the information, because I feel even though the pixel quality might be less in an image, there are millions of stories hidden behind it. Because when I take a picture of my mom, I feel like, okay, my mom, that thing, this thing. And when I take a picture of my laptop, there is a lot of emotion behind it, because sleepless nights, Kaggle days, and everything in and out of the college, everything comes up. Just like that, will data sets, let it be like in terms of real time training scenario, it can be of real time deployment of a model. Can it really change in the way that machine is thinking? That's what I really wanted you.
Oh, okay, okay,
That's
okay,
what I wanted
okay.
you to answer.
uh, I doubt at this stage, definitely not. uh, with regards
You
to
said, because as you
understanding
said,
the
if I build a brain on an hardware, that
Mhm.
means it has to learn
Mhm.
something new as a new parameter. It should not detect only car,
Yeah,
it should also detect something new. That was the kind of the
yeah.
question that I asked.
Okay. So, I mean, the algorithms are coming in that manner as well. I mean, if you see, there is semi-supervised learning algorithms coming in. Then there is self-supervised, of course, and unsupervised always was there. But with the advent of zero-shot learning, few-shot learning, things are moving towards that end, where using less data, I mean, using not as abundant as what a generalized deep learning takes it, but less data, the machine is able to interpret and understand what exactly we are expecting it to do. So I guess it is going with regards to data part, yes, it is going towards that end. But with regards to deployment and something like it could do on its own, or it could understand where to deploy it, how to deploy it, and things like those, it's more of a RPA problem or a reinforcement learning sort of a system, if you want intelligence with it, where it understands the processes, the different processes that exist, and it can take up and do those processes with for you. And I guess RPA, in some sort of sense, is doing that with regards to your low code systems, your faster UI, UX based systems. They are actually automating a lot of things. Like if you remember, FastAI, the original course of FastAI used to have a deployment on Elastic Beanstalk on AWS, where they mentioned the steps in a PDF as to click this, click that, do this, do that, and someone on their GitHub platform, or maybe somewhere else, created a low-code system over it, a wrapper over it, a simple wrapper over it, where once a model is trained, all the processes are completed. I mean, AWS provides an API where you can code things up. So all those things will be done, and it can be taken forward and deployed on your system, on your AWS cloud. So that is sort of a process automation where things are happening. And on the data set end, yes, people are working on smarter algorithms.
Yeah, you mentioned a lot about how algorithm can change in the future,
Mhm.
not in the present scenario. What's your experience with frameworks like OpenCV, TensorFlow, Monk? I'm not asking your
Mhm.
professional experience, but in terms of development,
Mhm.
how have they affected
Mhm.
your life in day-to-day life?
Affected my day-to-day life, as in they
A-
don't
As
have
in,
a very
as in,
good
in terms of,
effect.
making the life easier, because I feel
Mhm.
OpenCV might be an old framework which computer vision
Mhm.
had, but it still
Mhm.
has its charm. It has not lost it.
Yeah, it does. Yeah.
But TensorFlow came in, and the Tessellate had also given out the Monk toolkit.
Yeah, yeah,
What's your
yeah.
experience in working with those?
Hmm. The first thing was syntax. Basically, there were many frameworks coming in. I mean, when I started with computer vision and that thing, there was Cafe library, and installing it was like a hell lot of a thing. So do try installing it in your system once. That will give you a lot of experience about general Linux as such.
and
So,
even and even I used to feel it, because when we were supposed to do pip install TensorFlow at the time of 2016 mid, I was in second PU,
yeah,
I was
yeah.
just trying to do some TensorFlow. We were supposed to run it as CMD as an administrator, so that pip install TensorFlow
Uh-huh.
get installed. But nowadays it's a different story, because you don't have to run it as
Yeah,
an administrator also, everything will be added in your path. And it took me
yeah.
1 month to install TensorFlow. That means by the time I install it, I had the midterm exam. So now never got a chance
Okay.
to learn it. And when I came to engineering at 2017, I just started working on TensorFlow and all. So that's my experience there. Yeah, when you said cafe, yeah, it's an hell of a thing. I know that. I know that.
Yeah, I mean, there were, I mean, it was one of the best libraries at that point. TensorFlow was just developing,
Yeah.
and people used to create all your object detection and recognition systems using Cafe. So, yeah, that was one thing. In installation, then syntax, where a lot of libraries came in: PyTorch, your MXNet, your Chainer, then there's Paddle. Check it out, it's a good one, Paddle. It's good for parallel processing. and then there is H2O. I mean, there are a lot of libraries where every of those libraries has their own perks and has their own cons. One might work for you, one might not. You may be having your favorites. So that's the thing where syntaxes were so different that it became a real hectic case for me, and that was the primary reason in college that we thought, let's create something called as Monk, where I mean, we named it Monk just randomly, like let's go with the name. And the idea was to have a unified wrapper where you just code in one language, or you just code in one syntax, basically, not language, one syntax, and you select the engine, whatever you want, and it translates your code to the PyTorch readable code, and it works that way. So that was one thing that we thought of, but never worked on it. And 4 years later, in 2019, I was doing some client project, and I thought, let's have this internally so that it helps everyone understand as to what I mean. It helps everyone in the team to actually get over the syntax phase and work continuously. So that was where I started with Monk, and the tough part was, yes, the syntaxes and the installation part.
Yeah, you talked a lot about how client side interaction has to happen in order to get your projects also done and your learning also happen. Like, I
Yeah.
always had this one question on what will a computer vision engineer think about precision medicine. What's your view on it?
Mhm. Uh, I personally feel that it's something that is needed. I mean, you cannot have one solution for all. I mean, the Einstein's equation of one thing, I mean, one exact thing, I mean, one equation that rules them all. You can't go with such a model when it comes to medicinal treatment. Everyone is unique in their own way. We keep telling that, and it indeed is that we are unique in our own ways. So some sort of a medicine might work on you, but while it is working on me, it can have certain side effects. So there I feel very keenly that precision medicine is something that could come in and do a lot of benefits to certain I mean, it could work in a groupism manner where the groups are not very big but micro groups. And this, I mean, if you see, precision medicine existed long back, where if you were going for an organ transplant, I mean, it's a from back. I mean, long back, we are actually going up with things like first testing the blood types, then testing different diseases that one can have. I mean, effect of one disease on other person. All those things are being tested. So that is sort of, I feel, ki there's a part of precision medicine or precision healthcare that is coming in. And now, with regards to COVID vaccine, I mean, I guess it should be some sort of a case where not everyone is administered the same vaccine. Well, it's my opinion, but again, people can have different opinions on that. So precision medicine is something I would really want to see flourish, and it is flourishing.
Yeah, you told about how precision medicine can be useful in this scenario. Like, I just wanted to ask you, because you have been in the industry for quite a long time now, probably
Uh-huh.
even when you were just studying in a bachelor's, you were just working remotely. I just want
Yeah.
to ask your view on what was your best project and the worst project that you have ever done in your life. Your view on your view on it. What do you feel like, if I was there, if I had the same knowledge what I have today on the same day which I had the
Mhm.
problem statement, how would I have solved it?
Mhm.
How was my approach going to be? Like a kind of an approach, what you used to have today, what would have been that thing?
Okay.
Yeah, kind of your view on
Best
it.
project, I would say, I mean, definitely it's Monk, the Monk libraries, the three libraries I have developed. I mean, those are like, I keep very, I mean, I'm very close to those libraries, something like that. I developed it from scratch and wrote more than 1.5 lakh lines of code for that. So that is something I'm very close to it. Uh, I mean, it does everything for you. Basically, the classification part, the object detection part, and everything in low code, and doesn't take up the uh, hyperparameter tuning that you were talking about, doesn't take up that feature away from the user. It keeps it there. Only thing is, you start small, you keep exploring the expert phases of that library, the expert way you can handle that library. You start small and you grow big, and it does help with your project management as well. So that is something I feel it's a very good project as per me. And so that is one thing. Bad projects, I have had many. I mean, there was one where we were detecting illegal sand mining happening, and long back in college time, where the trucks used to have, trucks used to pass through a weighing container, and they used to they wanted some sort of a vision-based system where it detects how above the truck's limit the sand is. So there we started off with simple OpenCV based image segmentation. So there it was like no deep learning, nothing, just and there we took 3-4 trucks and we thought the algorithm is working superb. Let's start publishing a paper on it. And with papers, you tend to have, you need to give more examples and explain. And none of those hyperparameters that we chose were working on the next set of trucks that came in the picture. Because what we were simply doing is detecting yellow element in the image, nothing else than that. So sand can never be one color yellow. I mean, it can have multiple grades. So that was one thing. Then I guess I had lots and lots of stupid projects. One was I didn't know at first there existed deep learning libraries for neural networks. So I created that in Python, and I was like, yeah, I've done something real great. And after a day or so, a friend of mine came and told me, like, you could do this using a library that exists, and your coding level and what you have written is completely shitty. So these are the kind of things, like bad projects, and you always have like thousands of bad projects and 2 or 3 good projects that in your hand.
Yeah, you talked about how hyperparameter tuning is still kept by you, as it's the hustle which the deep learning enthusiast should have. What do you feel about hypertuner and optuner in terms of hyperparameter tuning? And also, do you
Yeah.
feel that making codes open source is tending to make us lazy today?
So starting with hyperparameter tuners, I mean, what they do is they are nothing but search spaces. I mean, there's an infinite 3D search space and n-dimensional search space, and you are finding the best fit for it. So basically, you are pre-looking into your global optima. You're trying to pre-look into your global optima. These hyperparameters will make you reach there. But it doesn't happen anytime, because that space is infinite space and you cannot be sure. I mean, if you were sure, that was AGI. If you are sure that this is these hyperparameters will get you the best accuracy, that's a very good step towards AGI, I feel. So that I still feel is a good thing to have. Even in Monk, I added a sort of a semi-automated hyperparameter tuner where people can run multiple experiments on small batches of data and see where their losses and accuracies are going, and in that manner select the best one. So this is sort of a search space examination where you are trying to understand how things would be. So I feel they are a good thing to start with, but what it gives you is not the 100% perfect result. And your second question was with regards to
Open sourcing the code,
open
is
source.
it
Yes.
making us lazy?
Open sourcing the code. uh, I have a feeling that if I mean, open source is the only thing that could take this industry quickly ahead. I mean, say you have a SOTA state-of-the-art paper on, say, object detection. If there's a code, the next person can work on that code rather than recreating what the paper has already done, is what I feel. So you have a baseline to start with and then take it up to adding your advancements rather than spending a lot of time on your previously, I mean, what the person has done on the paper and coding it up. So there, that way, yes, it's working, but yes, it's definitely making us lazy in a manner that we tend to take up a lot of codes and get done with it. But I guess with the technology, it's always good to not recreate what has already been done. If someone has created it, let it be. I mean, you don't have to recreate that thing and start something new. That's how this field is going to progress, is what is my perception.
Yeah, let's just talk about your libraries which you have created as a
Mhm.
person, and you have been that guy who has really worked hard in order to give that framework to the world. Like, let's just
Mhm.
rate it off. Like, let it be the number of frameworks which you have written. Rank me in
Mhm.
terms of complexity, one being the
Mhm.
most comfortable in terms
Mhm.
of complexity, three being, or
Mhm.
3 or 4 being the least in terms of more in terms of complexity. Rank me those
Okay.
3 libraries which you have created in terms of complexity,
Mhm.
because I just want to know your view on what you had created.
Okay, so I'll start with exactly what those three libraries are. So that will give you a perspective on why I'm ranking it that way. The first is a basic library that creates a wrapper, a unified wrapper over the major deep learning frameworks that exist, like PyTorch, Keras, TensorFlow, MXNet. At present, these are the 4 supported. I'm adding Chainer at present. So that's one thing. And it gives you a way to, I mean, all these three libraries basically give you a way to create thousands of experiments and compare them together. I mean, this is needed for, I mean, people working in the industry, as well as people tend to want to know how the project management is being done, and how exactly is the speed, and how exactly their training process is proceeding. So which one gives them the best accuracy and things like that. So these are the two important components of the first library. And of course, you have
Its name, its
the
name,
different things like
its name,
how.
its
Sorry.
name, its name.
Oh, okay, okay. The first is, yeah, I'm giving. So I was about to tell that at the end, but yeah. The first is Monk Image Classification Library, where you can write your code in one syntax and it does the entire work for you. The second is for more complex algorithms, Monk Object Detection Library, where things like, I mean, why it was created is the reason because you tend to have lots and lots of object detection and pose estimation, then image segmentation, all these algorithms, and every day new one keeps coming. So we thought, let's standardize the work in a manner that your installation process is easier. You don't have to worry about how the original author has written the code in a manner that you need not change it for your custom data set, because that's the ultimate goal. You want to take it up and train it on your custom data set. Then it gives you access to all the hyperparameters that need to be done. So all this process we wanted to standardize, and every author has, or every code owner has their unique way of writing things. Like they may use different libraries, and even if they are using the same library, say there is SSD PyTorch and someone also has created SSD PyTorch, both the people will be writing in a complete different way. So we wanted to standardize that part, and we created wrappers over these around 25 to 30 different pipelines, and it supports around 80 to 90 different models. So that was one thing. And here again, we came to TensorFlow, where there is TensorFlow Object Detection API. And we wanted, I mean, you will understand how complex that TensorFlow API is with regards to dependencies and how it's being installed in your system, how you are compiling that module. And then you will start with the training part and TF records and all those things. It's completely different from what PyTorch does. So we want to standardize this process, and hence we created the second library, Monk Object Detection. And then we thought, what about the non-coders? I mean, how would they take this up? So we created a simple PyQt based UI on top of it. I won't call it a very good UI, but it's something like that's manageable and people can work on it. So these are the three libraries that exist. I mean, there are multiple unique features in it, but I can't keep telling every of this in this short time because it took a year to develop it. This is the crux of it. And with regards to development part of it, I guess the classification one was the toughest for me, because I had to understand each and every element of each and every library and then create a wrapper on top of it. Like a data loader in Keras is completely different from a data loader in PyTorch. It takes in Torch Vision. So all these things I had to bring in first, understand how each and every of these libraries is working. Say there are X number of losses function in PyTorch and X number of loss function in TensorFlow, and there might be one missing there. So we had to bring it all in one roof, and then we started creating a wrapper on top of it. It was like a pet project for me, which it started just one night and it's still continuing. So that
Okay.
was the toughest part, the first one. The object detection one was easier. I mean, not easier, but yes, I got a gist of how things are working. So it was easier for me to manipulate and actually modify the codes of the original authors and create a wrapper on top of it. UI is something I am not good with.
The toolkit,
So I created, yeah, the
the Monk
Monk
toolkit.
Studio, which we call it.
Uh-huh.
Yeah, it's something. I mean, the UI is I'm not good with, so I used PyQt because I've worked with Qt in my GSOC. So I used PyQt and created a workable UI on top of it. That was the thing.
Being an author, talking about your own libraries which you have written, I think I can feel that proud moment which you had when you were talking about it. You know, uh, there has been a lot of speculations about computer vision and GANs. What's your view on GANs?
Hmm. GANs at starting stage, I mean, I feel there are many applications of GANs when it comes to the good part of it, where image in painting, then your data restoration, I mean, the
Even
restoration of
securitizing the
resolution.
data also, because GANs are
Yeah,
used
and
in
in a lot of
security.
manners, it is working. But with every good thing, there's attached bad element, and that is like your deep fakes, you're morphing the faces and creating lots of things. So it has both the elements of it. But with one good thing is it is being identified. It is clearly being identified where what a fake is and what is not. So I guess GANs will bring in a lot of things. I mean, uh, GANs ka jo, I mean, the back end of it, the adversarial nature is something a lot of games, a lot of, I mean, we see that in real life a lot of times. The adversarial nature is actually what is driving you. Inside you may be like, yeah, I want to I want to be like this person. I want to be like that person. But that there is something adversarial nature that I want to be better than this person is what is driving you. So I guess that element which Ian Goodfellow took off the gaming engine and brought it to the deep learning part of things is brilliant.
Yeah, you talked a lot about your framework and also how a computer vision engineer has to work in order to get his bread and butter. So now let me just ask that one question. I feel like there is an artist in every code. Let it be a simple code, yet there
Okay.
is an artist in everything. Can machines
Uh-huh.
replace that artist one day? That
The
means,
coding part of things.
yeah, can the
Yeah.
machine learn
Hmm.
themselves, code themselves, prepare themselves for the world? And also, what are the pros and the cons of having those machines of that intelligent? And can they replace a human being one day? Let it be a doctor, an engineer, can be anybody. What's your view on this?
Since you mentioned doctor, I'm really not against. I'm really against that part.
Even I did a
I mean,
podcast with the
yeah,
doctor. He literally said we should
uh-huh.
not cross our boundaries because we have
Yeah,
our
yeah,
responsibilities.
yeah. I mean, his perspective would be towards his own job as well. But yeah, as a, uh, we tend to be patients. I mean, as a patient, I wouldn't want a machine to treat me. I would want a human presence to be there. That brings in empathy because at present, machines have never been good with empathy. And doctors also don't showcase empathy towards their patient, but somehow a human element helps you understand that there is some sort of an empathy. I mean, if he goes showing empathy towards a patient, he won't be able to treat it, but it's something embedded inside us. We are confident when a human is present along with the machine. Of course, machine is helping a lot of, in a lot of ways, helping the doctors, be it neuroscience, be it complex operations, where they are being used as assistive element. So that is one phase where I'm not sure about whether I would be accepting only machine treatment someday. But with regards to coding, I guess it is already happening in some or the other way. Like Philip recently on LinkedIn mentioned about Dockly, I guess. I guess the name was Dockly, where it generates your documentation using doc strings very easily. So things are happening in that sense. I mean, earlier we used to write the documentation. Now it's being automated in some or the other manner. So with regards to coding, there is suggestive coding or automated coding. I mean, suggestive text has come up. So there, I guess things are being learned. But yes, when there is some sort of processes, these are the X number of lines or these are the X number of things are always there and elements in it change, like the arguments in that functions change, then I guess the automation is easier at present. And it's happening with low code things. But writing a complete new code and, as you mentioned, the artistic nature of it, I doubt it's happening in a short time. But yes, it may happen.
Yeah. Abhishek sir, thank you so much for being part of the podcast. I think I am not willing to send you out of the podcast, but yet the questions have ended now. I can't do anything now. So I think it was amazing speaking to you regarding the computer vision,
Thank
about
you.
the three frameworks which you have given to the world, the Monk,
Yeah.
and it's amazing in terms of working. I saw the documentation and I'm about to learn it, and I'll be part of the workshop which you are going to
Yeah.
give us from the TFUG Bangalore. And I
Yeah.
think I think one day I just want to be an engineer as good as you. Thank you so much for
Oh
coming
man,
to
that's
my
a
part.
very good thing to say. I mean, it means a lot to me.
Thank you so much for coming to the podcast and giving your time,
Thank
giving
you.
your knowledge for all the viewers. Thank you so much.
Sure. Always happy